It was a late Friday evening when the rest of the office had long since emptied. The quiet hum of fluorescent lights overhead was the only noise filling the dimly lit room as I remained at my desk, determined to finish the last of my tasks before the weekend began. My boss, Mr. Harrison, had mentioned that he would stay late too. He was always the last to leave, always the first to arrive in the morning, a habit developed over his 40 years in the business. At 64, Mr. Harrison had a commanding presence, one that was difficult to ignore. He was the type of man who carried himself with quiet authority, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, his tailored suits always impeccable. Despite his age, there was something undeniably magnetic about him, a confidence that I couldn't help but notice during our interactions. I had never thought much about it before. After all, he was my boss, and I was just a young assistant trying to climb the corporate ladder. But over the past few months, things had begun to shift. It started with the way his gaze lingered on me a little longer than usual during meetings, the way his voice softened when he called me into his office to discuss projects. At first, I told myself it was nothing. I was reading too much into it. But then there were the moments when we found ourselves alone in the office, exchanging small talk that felt more personal than professional, our conversations lingering as the hours stretched late into the evening. There was an unspoken connection between us, one that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. It was subtle at first, just a quiet tension in the air whenever we were alone, but it grew stronger with each passing day. Tonight was no different. I could hear the sound of his footsteps approaching my desk, and when I looked up, there he was, standing in the doorway of his office, his hands in his pockets, watching me. "Still here?" he asked, his voice carrying that familiar calm authority. "You should be heading home by now." I smiled, feeling a flutter in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. "Just finishing up. I didn't want to leave anything undone before the weekend." He nodded, stepping closer. His presence seemed to fill the room, and I felt my heart rate quicken as he leaned against the edge of my desk, his eyes fixed on mine. "You work too hard. You should learn to take it easy." There was something in his tone, something softer than usual, and for a moment I wondered if I had imagined it. But when his gaze flickered down to my hands resting on the keyboard, I felt that familiar spark of tension between us. "I don't mind," I replied, my voice a little quieter now. "I enjoy the work." He smiled, a slow, almost knowing smile, and for a moment, I thought I saw something shift in his expression, something more personal, more intimate. He was so close now, closer than he had ever been before, and I could feel the heat of his body radiating toward me, making the air between us feel heavy. "You're a dedicated employee," he said, his voice lower now, more intimate. "But you need to take care of yourself, too." I swallowed hard, feeling a sudden wave of warmth wash over me. The way he was looking at me, the way his voice wrapped around the words, made my skin tingle with awareness. My mind raced with thoughts I couldn't control, thoughts I knew I shouldn't be having, but I couldn't push them away. There was something undeniable between us, something that had been building for months, and now, with the office empty and the lights dimmed, it felt impossible to ignore. Mr. Harrison didn't move, and neither did I. The silence between us stretched on, charged with an intensity one wasn't prepared for. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the tension building in the small space between us. His eyes never left mine, and for a moment, I wondered if he could sense the shift in the air as much as I did. "Do you ever think about what you want beyond this job?" he asked softly, his voice a low rumble that sent shivers down my spine. It was such a simple question, but the way he asked it, the way his gaze lingered on me, made it feel loaded with meaning. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I simply nodded, feeling my mouth go dry. "Of course," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone has dreams." His gaze flickered over me, and I felt a warmth spread through my chest, a strange mix of nerves and something more dangerous. "Dreams," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "What kind of dreams do you have?" The way he asked that, so quietly, so intimately, made my heart race. I had the sudden, overwhelming urge to be honest with him, to tell him everything I had been thinking and feeling over the past few months. But I couldn't. This was my boss. The man who had built a reputation for being composed, professional, untouchable. My voice caught in my throat. I didn't know how to answer. Not without revealing too much. Not without crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. But then, as if sensing my hesitation, Mr. Harrison leaned in just a fraction closer, his fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the desk, so close to where my hand rested. It was a small gesture, so subtle, I wasn't sure if it had been intentional, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced up at him, and for a split second, the mask he always wore seemed to slip, revealing something raw, something vulnerable. "Don't worry," he murmured, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to say anything." His words hung in the air between us, and I felt my breath hitch. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew we were dangerously close to crossing a line. My mind was screaming at me to pull back, to put distance between us, but my body wasn't listening. All I could do was stare up at him, caught in the intensity of his gaze. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The tension between us was palpable, like a wire stretched too tight, ready to snap. His hand inched closer to mine, and I could feel the heat of his skin just barely grazing mine. It was such a small, seemingly innocent touch, but it was enough to make my heart race, enough to make me forget all the reasons why this was a bad idea. Then slowly, deliberately, he closed the distance between us. His fingers brushed against mine, sending a shockwave through my body. I sucked in a breath, my eyes widening in surprise, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Something had shifted between us, something that neither of us could ignore any longer. "I've been thinking about you," he admitted quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "More than I should." The confession hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. My mind was reeling, trying to process what he had just said, but all I could focus on was the way his hand felt against mine, the warmth of his touch, the way his words made my heart race. "I don't know what this is," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But I can't stop thinking about you either." The words slipped out before I could stop them, and as soon as they did, I felt a surge of panic. I had crossed a line. We both had. But instead of pulling away, Mr. Harrison stayed where he was, his fingers still lightly touching mine, his gaze intense and unwavering. "You're not alone," he murmured, his voice low and filled with something I couldn't quite name. "I've been struggling with this, too." There it was. The truth laid bare between us. We both knew it now, acknowledged the connection that had been simmering beneath the surface for months. And yet, even with the admission out in the open, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to close the distance between us entirely. He moved first, his fingers sliding over mine, and I felt my breath hitch in my throat. It was such a small touch, but it was enough to send a flood of warmth through me, enough to make me forget where we were, what we were doing. His hand rested on mine, his touch firm and steady, and I knew in that moment that we had crossed a line. There was no going back. I didn't pull away. Instead, I found myself leaning into the touch, my heart pounding in my chest as the tension between us escalated. He was so close now, his body towering over mine, and I could feel the heat of him, smell the faint scent of his cologne. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but none of them were strong enough to stop what was happening. "You should go home," he said softly, though his hand didn't move from mine. But I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to break the moment, didn't want to walk away from whatever this was between us. So instead of responding, I stayed where I was, my eyes locked on his, my body still tingling from the electric touch of his hand. "Maybe I don't want to," I whispered, barely able to believe the words as they left my mouth. Mr. Harrison's eyes darkened, and for a long moment, he just looked at me, as if weighing the consequences of what was happening. Then, slowly, he leaned down, his breath warm against my cheek as he spoke. "Are you sure about that?" His voice was low, dangerous, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I nodded, unable to find my voice, and in that moment, the last thread of restraint between us snapped. The moment hung in the air, thick with tension. His breath was so close, just brushing against my skin, and I could feel the heat radiating from his body. Everything else faded. The office, the empty halls, the clock ticking in the background, until there was only him, only us, standing on the precipice of something we couldn't take back. Without another word, he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a hesitant, almost testing kiss. My heart stuttered, and for a split second, I froze. But then, as if something inside me broke free, I kissed him back. It was slow at first, soft and tentative, like we were both afraid of what this meant, but then it deepened, the hesitation melting away as the intensity between us grew. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the strength in his grip, the way his body seemed to fit against mine perfectly. My mind was spinning, caught between the overwhelming desire that coursed through me and the nagging voice in the back of my head telling me that this was wrong. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. As the kiss deepened, the rest of the world seemed to disappear. There was only the feel of his hands on my skin, the warmth of his breath mingling with mine, the electric current that seemed to pulse through me with every touch. It was intense, consuming, and completely forbidden, but I couldn't bring myself to care. His lips moved from mine, trailing down to my neck, and I felt a shiver run through me as his hands explored my body, each touch igniting a fire that I couldn't control. I let out a soft gasp, my fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as I held on to him, desperate to keep him close, to keep the moment from slipping away. "We shouldn't be doing this," he murmured against my skin, though his hands didn't stop moving, his touch growing more confident, more urgent. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely audible, my heart racing. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did he, it seemed, because the next thing I knew, he was guiding me toward his office, the door clicking shut behind us as the world outside was forgotten. The room was dimly lit, the shadows casting long shapes across the walls, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound breaking the silence. I was aware of every second, every touch, every breath. He pulled me close again, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was far more intense than the first, filled with a need that neither of us could deny any longer. His hands roamed over my body, pulling me against him, and I felt the heat of his touch through the thin fabric of my blouse. "I've wanted this for a long time," he admitted, his voice rough with desire as he pressed his forehead to mine. "I just didn't think it could happen." I met his gaze, my breath coming in short, quick bursts. "Me too." That was all it took to break whatever restraint we had left. His hands moved to my blouse, his fingers working quickly to unbutton it, and I could feel the tension in his movements, the way his breath hitched as he pulled the fabric aside, revealing my skin. I wasn't thinking anymore, couldn't think. All I could do was feel the heat of his hands, the urgency in his touch, the way my body responded to him without hesitation. Before I knew it, we were tangled together on the couch in his office, our clothes discarded in a pile on the floor. His body was pressed against mine, his skin warm and firm, and I felt the weight of him, the way he held me close, like he couldn't bear to let go. Every touch, every kiss, every movement sent waves of pleasure through me, and I was lost in him, in us, in the moment that had consumed us both. It was everything I had imagined and more, intense, raw, and filled with an urgency that neither of us could control. We moved together in perfect harmony, our bodies responding to each other as if we had done this 1,000 times before. I felt the heat building inside me, the tension coiling tighter and tighter until it snapped, sending a flood of sensation crashing over me. I gasped, my fingers digging into his shoulders as I held on to him, the intensity of the moment almost too much to bear. He groaned softly, his breath hot against my neck as he followed me over the edge, his body trembling against mine as we both came down from the high. For a long time, neither of us moved. We just lay there, tangled together, our breaths coming in shallow gasps as the reality of what we had just done began to sink in. The room was quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the air conditioning and the rapid beating of my heart in my chest. Eventually, he shifted, propping himself up on his elbow to look down at me. His face was flushed, his hair tousled, and for a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. "What happens now?" I asked quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. He sighed, running a hand through his hair as he sat up, his back to me. I don't know. There it was, the uncertainty that had been lurking in the back of my mind since this all began. We had crossed a line, one that couldn't be undone, and now we had to face the consequences. I sat up too, pulling the blanket around my shoulders as I tried to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. Do you regret it? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his expression thoughtful, conflicted. I don't know, he said finally. Part of me wants to say yes, but another part of me doesn't. The confession hung in the air between us, and I felt my heart clench in my chest. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of the jumble of emotions inside me. All I knew was that this had changed everything, and I wasn't sure if we could ever go back. We can't keep doing this, he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. I know, I whispered, my throat tight. But I don't want to forget it either. He looked at me then, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place, something between longing and sadness, and maybe even a little bit of guilt. Neither do I. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of our actions settling over us like a heavy blanket. There were no easy answers, no way to fix what had been broken. All we could do was pick up the pieces and try to move forward, knowing that things would never be the same. When I finally stood up to leave, I hesitated at the door, turning back to look at him one last time. He was still sitting on the couch, his head in his hands, and I could see the strain in his posture, the conflict written all over his face. Take care of yourself, I said softly, my voice thick with emotion. You too, he replied, not looking up. And with that, I walked out the door, leaving him and whatever we had behind.